Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Danielle, Violet and Avon, Juanita, and Dong-Young Huang. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener-supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes, giveaways, and chapter-by-chapter fictional readings found nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip. No subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's continue our month of travel readings with more from a book we haven't read from in some time. Let's relax with Pictures from Italy by Charles Dickens, with 8 illustrations by Marcus Stone, R.A., published in this edition in 1913 by Chapman and Hall Limited, London. Let's pick up right where we left off as we tour the streets of 19th century Genoa. Let's begin. Hard by the gaming area where the men were playing is a large palazzo, formerly belonging to some member of the Brignole family, but just now hired by a school of Jesuits for their summer quarters. I walked into its dismantled precincts the other evening about sunset and couldn't help pacing up and down for a little time, drowsily taking in the aspect of the place, which is repeated hereabouts in all directions. I loitered to and fro under a colonnade, forming 2 sides of a weedy, grass-grown courtyard, whereof the house formed a 3rd side, and a low terrace walk overlooking the garden and the neighboring hills, the 4th. I don't believe there was an uncracked stone in the whole pavement. In the center was a melancholy statue, so piebald in its decay that it looked exactly as if it had been covered with sticking plaster and afterwards powdered. The stables, coach houses, offices were all empty, all ruinous, all utterly deserted. Doors had lost their hinges and were holding on by their latches. Windows were broken. Painted plaster had peeled off and was lying about in clods. Fowls and cats had so taken possession of the outbuildings that I couldn't help thinking of the fairy tales and eyeing them with suspicion as transformed retainers waiting to be changed back again. One old Tom in particular, a scraggy brute with a hungry green eye, a poor relation in reality, I am inclined to think, came prowling round and round me, as if he half believed for the moment that I might be the hero come to marry the lady and set all to rights. But discovering his mistake, he suddenly gave a grim snarl and walked away with such a tremendous tail that he couldn't get into the little hole where he lived, but was obliged to wait outside until his indignation and his tail had gone down together. In a sort of summer house, or whatever it may be, in this colonnade, some Englishmen had been living like grubs in a nut. But the Jesuits had given them notice to go, and they had gone, and that was shut up too. The house, a wandering, echoing, thundering barrack of a place, with the lower windows barred up as usual, was wide open at the door, and I have no doubt I might have gone in, and gone to bed, and gone dead, and nobody a bit the wiser. Only one suite of rooms on an upper floor was tenanted, and from one of these the voice of a young lady vocalist, practicing bravura lustily, came flaunting out upon the silent evening. I went down into the garden, intended to be prim and quaint, with avenues and terraces, and orange trees and statues, and water in stone basins, and everything was green, gaunt, weedy, straggling, undergrown or overgrown, mildewy, damp, redolent of all sorts of slabby, clammy, creeping, and uncomfortable life. There was nothing bright in the whole scene but a firefly, one solitary firefly, showing against the dark bushes like the last little speck of the departed glory of the house, and even it went flitting up and down at sudden angles, and leaving a place with a jerk, and describing an irregular circle, and returning to the same place with a twitch that startled one, as if it were looking for the rest of the glory, and wondering, heaven knows it might, what had become of it. In the course of 2 months, the flitting shapes and shadows of my dismal entering reverie gradually resolved themselves into familiar forms and substances, and I already began to think that when the time should come a year hence for closing the long holiday and turning back to England, I might part from Genoa with anything but a glad heart. It is a place that grows upon you every day. There seems to be always something to find out in it. There are the most extraordinary alleys and byways to walk about in. You can lose your way. What a comfort that is when you are idle, 20 times a day if you like, and turn up again under the most unexpected and surprising difficulties. It abounds in the strangest contrasts, things that are picturesque, ugly, mean, magnificent, delightful, and offensive break upon the view at every turn. They who would know how beautiful the country immediately surrounding Genoa is should climb in clear weather to the top of Monte Faccio, or at least ride round the city walls, a feat more easily performed. No prospect can be more diversified and lovely than the changing views of the harbor and the valleys of the 2 rivers, the Polcevera and the Bisagno, from the heights along which the strongly fortified walls are carried, like the Great Wall of China in little. In not the least picturesque part of this ride, there is a fair specimen of a real Genoese tavern, where the visitor may derive good entertainment from real Genoese dishes such as tagliarini, ravioli, German sausages strong of garlic, sliced and eaten with fresh green figs, coxcombs and sheep kidneys, chopped up with mutton chops and liver, small pieces of some unknown part of a calf, twisted into small shreds, fried and served up in a great dish like whitebait, and other curiosities of that kind. They often get wine at these suburban trattori from France and Spain and Portugal, which is brought over by small captains in little trading vessels. They buy it at so much a bottle without asking what it is or caring to remember if anybody tells them, and usually divide it into 2 heaps, of which they label one champagne and the other Madeira. The various opposite flavors, qualities, countries, ages, and vintages that are comprised under these 2 general heads is quite extraordinary. The most limited range is probably from cool gruel up to old Marsala and down again to apple tea. The great majority of the streets are as narrow as any thoroughfare can well be, where people, even Italian people, are supposed to live and walk about, being mere lanes with here and there a kind of well or breathing place. The houses are immensely high, painted in all sorts of colors, and are in every stage and state of damage, dirt, and lack of repair. They are commonly let off in floors or flats, like the houses in the old town of Edinburgh, or many houses in Paris. There are few street doors. The entrance halls are, for the most part, looked upon as public property, and any moderately enterprising scavenger might make a fine fortune by now and then clearing them out. As it is impossible for coaches to penetrate into these streets, there are sedan chairs, gilded or otherwise, for hire in diverse places. A great many private chairs are also kept among the nobility and gentry, and at night these are trotted to and fro in all directions, preceded by bearers of great lanterns made of linen stretched upon a frame. The sedans and lanterns are the legitimate successors of the long strings of patient and much abused mules that go jingling their little bells through these confined streets all day long. They follow them as regularly as the stars the sun. When shall I forget the streets of palaces, the Strada Nuovo and the Strada Balbi, or how the former looked one summer day when I first saw it underneath the brightest and most intensely blue of summer skies, which its narrow perspective of immense mansions reduced to a tapering and most precious strip of brightness, looking down upon the heavy shade below, a brightness not too common, even in July and August, to be well esteemed, for if the truth must out, there were not 8 blue skies in as many midsummer weeks, saving sometimes early in the morning, when looking out to sea, the water and the firmament were one world of deep and brilliant blue. At other times there were clouds and haze enough to make an Englishman grumble in his own climate. The endless details of these rich palaces, the walls of some of them within, alive with masterpieces by Van Dyck, the great heavy stone balconies one above another, and tier over tier, with here and there one larger than the rest, towering high up, a huge marble platform. The doorless vestibules, massively barred lower windows, immense public staircases, thick marble pillars, strong dungeon-like arches, and dreary, dreaming, echoing vaulted chambers, among which the eye wanders again and again and again, as every palace is succeeded by another. The terrace gardens between house and house, with green arches of the vine and groves of orange trees, and blushing oleander in full bloom, 20, 30, 40 feet above the street. The painted halls, moldering and blotting and rotting in the damp corners, and still shining out in beautiful colors and voluptuous designs where the walls are dry. The faded figures on the outsides of the houses, holding wreaths and crowns and flying upward and downward, and standing in niches, and here and there looking fainter and more feeble than elsewhere, by contrast with some fresh little cupids, who on a more recently decorated portion of the front are stretching out what seems to be the semblance of a blanket, but is indeed a sundial. The steep, steep uphill streets of small palaces, but very large palaces for all that, with marble terraces looking down into close byways, the magnificent and innumerable churches, and the rapid passage from a street of stately edifices into a maze of the vilest squalor, steaming with unwholesome stenches, and swarming with half-naked children, and whole worlds of dirty people, make up altogether such a scene of wonder, so lively and yet so dead, so noisy and yet so quiet, so obtrusive and yet so shy and lowering, so wide awake and yet so fast asleep, that it is a sort of intoxication to a stranger to walk on and on and on and look about him. A bewildering phantasmagoria with all the inconsistency of a dream, and all the pain and all the pleasure of an extravagant reality. The different uses to which some of these palaces are applied all at once is characteristic. For instance, the English banker, my excellent and hospitable friend, has his office in a good-sized palazzo in the Strada Nuova. In the hall, every inch of which is elaborately painted, but which is as dirty as a police station in London, a hook-nosed Saracen's head with an immense quantity of black hair, there is a man attached to it, sells walking sticks. On the other side of the doorway, a lady with a showy handkerchief for headdress, wife to the Saracen's head, I believe, sells articles of her own knitting and sometimes flowers. A little further in, 2 or 3 blind men occasionally beg. Sometimes they are visited by a man without legs on a little go-cart, but who has such a fresh-colored, lively face, and such a respectable, well-conditioned body, that he looks as if he had sunk into the ground up to his middle, or had come but partially up a flight of cellar steps to speak to somebody. A little further in, a few men perhaps lie asleep in the middle of the day, or they may be chairmen waiting for their absent freight. If so, they have brought their chairs in with them, and there they stand also. On the left of the hall is a little room, a hatter's shop. On the first floor is the English bank. On the first floor also is a whole house, and a good large residence too. Heaven knows what there may be above that, but when you are there, you have only just begun to go upstairs, and yet coming downstairs again, thinking of this, and passing out a great crazy door in the back of the hall, instead of turning the other way to get into the street again, it bangs behind you, making the dismalest and most lonesome echoes, and you stand in a yard, the yard of the same house, which seems to have been unvisited by human foot for 100 years. Not a sound disturbs its repose, not a head, thrust out of any of the grim, dark, jealous windows within sight, makes the weeds in the cracked pavement faint of heart by suggesting the possibility of there being hands to grub them up. Opposite to you is a giant figure carved in stone, reclining with an urn upon a lofty piece of artificial rockwork, and out of the urn dangles the end of a leaden pipe, which once upon a time poured a small torrent down the rocks. But the eye sockets of the giant are not drier than this channel is now. He seems to have given his urn, which is nearly upside down, a final tilt, and after crying like a sepulchral child, all gone, to have lapsed into a stony silence. In the streets of shops, the houses are much smaller, but of great size notwithstanding, and extremely high. They are very dirty, quite undrained, if my nose be at all reliable, and emit a peculiar fragrance, like the smell of very bad cheese kept in very hot blankets. Notwithstanding the height of the houses, there would seem to have been a lack of room in the city, for new houses are thrust in everywhere. Wherever it has been possible to cram a tumble-down tenement into a crack or corner, in it has gone. If there be a nook or angle in the wall of a church, or a crevice in any other dead wall of any sort, there you are sure to find some kind of habitation, looking as if it had grown there like a fungus. Against the government house, against the old Senate house, round about any large building, little shops stick so close, like parasite vermin to the great carcass, and for all this, look where you may, up steps, down steps, anywhere, everywhere, there are irregular houses, receding, starting forward, tumbling down, leaning against their neighbors, crippling themselves or their friends by some means or other, until one, more irregular than the rest, chokes up the way and you can't see any further. One of the rottenest looking parts of the town, I think, is down by the landing wharf, though it may be that its being associated with a great deal of rottenness on the evening of our arrival has stamped it deeper in my mind. Here again the houses are very high, and are of an infinite variety of deformed shapes, and have, as most of the houses have, something hanging out of a great many windows, and wafting its frowsy fragrance on the breeze. Sometimes it is a curtain, sometimes it is a carpet, sometimes it is a bed, sometimes a whole line full of clothes, but there is almost always something. Before the basement of these houses is an arcade over the pavement, very massive, dark, and low, like an old crypt. The stone or plaster of which it is made has turned quite black, and against every one of these black piles, all sorts of filth and garbage seem to accumulate spontaneously. Beneath some of the arches, the sellers of macaroni and polenta establish their stalls, which are by no means inviting. The offal of a fish market near at hand, that is to say, of a back lane where people sit upon the ground and on various old bulkheads and sheds, and sell fish when they have any to dispose of, and of a vegetable market constructed on the same principle, are contributed to the decoration of this quarter. And as all the mercantile business is transacted here, and it is crowded all day, it has a very decided flavor about it. The Porto Franco, or free port, where goods brought in from foreign countries pay no duty until they are sold and taken out, as in a bonded warehouse in England, is down here also, and two portentous officials in cocked hats stand at the gate to search you if they choose, and to keep out monks and ladies, for sanctity as well as beauty has been known to yield to the temptation of smuggling, and in the same way, that is to say, by concealing the smuggled property beneath the loose folds of its dress. So sanctity and beauty may by no means enter. The streets of Genoa would be all the better for the importation of a few priests of prepossessing appearance. Every fourth or fifth man in the streets is a priest or a monk, and there is pretty sure to be at least one itinerant ecclesiastic inside or outside every hackney carriage on the neighboring roads. I have no knowledge elsewhere of more repulsive countenances than are to be found among these gentry. If nature's handwriting be at all legible, greater varieties of sloth, deceit, and intellectual torpor could hardly be observed among any class of men in the world. Mr. Pepys once heard a clergyman assert in his sermon, in illustration of his respect for the priestly office, that if he could meet a priest and angel together, he would salute the priest first. I am rather of the opinion of Petrarch, who when his pupil Boccaccio wrote to him in great tribulation that he had been visited and admonished for his writings by a Carthusian friar, who claimed to be a messenger immediately commissioned by heaven for that purpose, replied that for his own part he would take the liberty of testing the reality of the commission by personal observation of the messenger's face, eyes, forehead, behavior, and discourse. I cannot but believe myself from similar observation that many unaccredited celestial messengers may be seen skulking through the streets of Genoa, or droning away their lives in other Italian towns. Perhaps the Cappuccini, though not a learned body, are as an order the best friends of the people. They seem to mingle with them more immediately as their counselors and comforters, and to go among them more when they are sick, and to pry less than some other orders into the secrets of families, for the purpose of establishing a baleful ascendancy over their weaker members, and to be influenced by a less fierce desire to make converts, and once made to let them go to ruin soul and body. They may be seen in their coarse dress in all parts of the town at all times, and begging in the markets early in the morning. The Jesuits, too, muster strong in the streets, and go slinking noiselessly about in pairs like black cats. In some of the narrow passages, distinct trades congregate. There is a street of jewelers, and there is a row of booksellers. But even down in places where nobody ever can or ever could penetrate in a carriage, There are mighty old palaces shut in amongst the gloomiest and closest walls, and almost shut out from the sun. Very few of the tradesmen have any idea of setting forth their goods or disposing them for show. If you, a stranger, want to buy anything, you usually look round the shop till you see it, then clutch it if it be within reach, and inquire how much. Everything is sold at the most unlikely place. If you want coffee, you go to a sweetmeat shop, and if you want meat, you will probably find it behind an old checked curtain, down half a dozen steps, in some sequestered nook as hard to find as if the commodity were poison, and Genoa's law were death to any that uttered it. Most of the apothecary shops are great lounging places. Here grave men with sticks sit down in the shade for hours together, passing a meager Genoa paper from hand to hand, and talking drowsily and sparingly about the news. 2 or 3 of these are poor physicians, ready to proclaim themselves on an emergency and tear off with any messenger who may arrive. You may know them by the way in which they stretch their necks to listen when you enter, and by the sigh with which they fall back again into their dull corners on finding that you only want medicine. Few people lounge in the barber's shops, though they are very numerous, as hardly any man shaves himself. But the apothecary's has its group of loungers who sit back among the bottles, with their hands folded over the tops of their sticks, so still and quiet that either you don't see them in the darkened shop or mistake them, as I did one ghostly man in bottle green one day, with a hat like a stopper for horse medicine. On a summer evening, the Genoese are as fond of putting themselves as their ancestors were of putting houses in every available inch of space in and about the town. In all the lanes and alleys, and up every little ascent, and on every dwarf wall, and on every flight of steps, they cluster like bees. Meanwhile, and especially on festa days, the bells of the churches ring incessantly, not in peals or any known form of sound, but in a horrible, irregular, jerking dingle, 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 with a sudden stop at every 15th dingle or so, which is maddening. This performance is usually achieved by a boy up in the steeple, who takes hold of the clapper or a little rope attached to it, and tries to dingle louder than every other boy similarly employed. The noise is supposed to be particularly obnoxious to evil spirits, but looking up into the steeples, and seeing and hearing these young Christians thus engaged, one might very naturally mistake them for the enemy. Festa days, early in the autumn, are very numerous. All the shops were shut up twice within a week for these holidays, and one night all the houses in the neighborhood of a particular church were illuminated, while the church itself was lighted outside with torches, and a grove of blazing links was erected in an open space outside one of the city gates. This part of the ceremony is prettier and more singular a little way in the country, where you can trace the illuminated cottages all the way up a steep hillside, and where you pass festoons of tapers wasting away in the starlight night before some lonely little house upon the road. On these days, they always dress the church of the saint in whose honor the festa is holden very gaily. Gold-embroidered festoons of different colors hang from the arches. The altar furniture is set forth, and sometimes even the lofty pillars are swathed from top to bottom in tight-fitting draperies. The cathedral is dedicated to St. Lorenzo. On St. Lorenzo's day, we went into it just as the sun was setting. Although these decorations are usually in very indifferent taste, the effect just then was very superb indeed, for the whole building was dressed in red, and the sinking sun streaming in through a great red curtain in the chief doorway made all the gorgeousness its own. When the sun went down, and it gradually grew quite dark inside, except for a few twinkling tapers on the principal altar and some small dangling silver lamps, it was very mysterious and effective. But sitting in any of the churches towards evening is like a mild dose of opium. With the money collected at a festa, they usually pay for the dressing of the church, and for the hiring of the band, and for the tapers. If there be any left, which seldom happens, I believe, the souls in purgatory get the benefit of it. They are also supposed to have the benefit of the exertions of certain small boys, who shake money boxes before some mysterious little buildings like rural turnpikes, which, usually shut up close, fly open on red-letter days, and disclose an image and some flowers inside. Just without the city gate, on the Albara Road, is a small house with an altar in it and a stationary money box, also for the benefit of the souls in purgatory. Still further to stimulate the charitable, there is a monstrous painting on the plaster, on either side of the grated door, representing a select party of souls frying. One of them has a gray mustache and an elaborate head of gray hair, as if he had been taken out of a hairdresser's window and cast into the furnace. There he is, a most grotesque and hideously comic old soul, forever blistering in the real sun and melting in the mimic fire for the gratification and improvement and the contributions of the poor Genoese. They are not a very joyous people, and are seldom seen to dance on their holidays, the staple places of entertainment among the women being the churches and the public walks. They are very good-tempered, obliging, and industrious. Industry has not made them clean, for their habitations are extremely filthy, and their usual occupation on a fine Sunday morning is to sit at their doors hunting in each other's heads. But their dwellings are so close and confined that if those parts of the city had been beaten down by Messina in the time of the terrible blockade, it would have at least occasioned one public benefit among many misfortunes. The peasant women with naked feet and legs are so constantly washing clothes in the public tanks and in every stream and ditch that one cannot help wondering, in the midst of all this dirt, who wears them when they are clean. The custom is to lay the wet linen, which is being operated upon, on a smooth stone, and hammer away at it with a flat wooden mallet. This they do as furiously as if they were revenging themselves on dress in general for being connected with the fall of mankind. It is not unusual to see, lying on the edge of the tank at these times, or on another flat stone, an unfortunate baby, tightly swathed up, arms and legs and all, in an enormous quantity of wrapper, so that it is unable to move a toe or finger. This custom, which we often see represented in old pictures, is universal among the common people. A child is left anywhere without the possibility of crawling away, or is accidentally knocked off a shelf, or tumbled out of bed, or is hung up to a hook now and then, and left dangling like a doll at an English rag shop, without the least inconvenience to anybody. I was sitting one Sunday, soon after my arrival, in the little country church of San Martino, a couple of miles from the city, while a baptism took place. I saw the priest and an attendant with a large taper, and a man and a woman and some others, but I had no more idea until the ceremony was all over that it was a baptism, or that the curious little stiff instrument that was passed from one to another in the course of the ceremony by the handle like a short poker was a child than I had that it was my own christening. I borrowed the child afterwards for a minute or two. It was lying across the font then, and found it very red in the face but perfectly quiet, and not to be bent on any terms. The number of cripples in the streets soon ceased to surprise me. There are plenty of saints and virgin shrines, of course, generally at the corners of streets. The favorite memento to the faithful about Genoa is a painting representing a peasant on his knees, with a spade and some other agricultural implements beside him, and the Madonna with the infant Savior in her arms, appearing to him in a cloud. This is the legend of the Madonna della Guardia, a chapel on a mountain within a few miles, which is in high repute. It seems that this peasant lived all alone by himself, tilling some land atop of the mountain, where, being a devout man, he daily said his prayers to the Virgin in the open air, for his hut was a very poor one. Upon a certain day, the Virgin appeared to him as in the picture and said, "Why do you pray in the open air and without a priest?" The peasant explained because there was neither priest nor church at hand, a very uncommon complaint indeed in Italy. "I should wish then," said the celestial visitor, "to have a chapel built here, in which the prayers of the faithful may be offered up." "But, Santissima Madonna," said the peasant, "I am a poor man, and chapels cannot be built without money. They must be supported too, Santissima, for to have a chapel and not support it liberally is a wickedness, a deadly sin." This sentiment gave great satisfaction to the visitor. "Go," said she. "There is such a village in the valley on the left, and such another village in the valley on the right, and such another village elsewhere, that will gladly contribute to the building of a chapel. Go to them, relate what you have seen, and do not doubt that sufficient money will be forthcoming to erect my chapel, or that it will afterwards be handsomely maintained." All of which, miraculously, turned out to be quite true, and in proof of this prediction and revelation, there is the chapel of the Madonna della Guardia, rich and flourishing at this day. The splendor and variety of the Genoese churches can hardly be exaggerated. The Church of the Annunziata especially, built like many of the others at the cost of one noble family, and now in slow progress of repair, from the outer door to the utmost height of the high cupola, is so elaborately painted and set in gold that it looks, as Simon describes it in his charming book on Italy, like a great enameled snuff box. Most of the richer churches contain some beautiful pictures or other embellishments of great price, almost universally set side by side with sprawling effigies of maudlin monks and the veriest trash and tinsel ever seen. It may be a consequence of the frequent direction of the popular mind and pocket to the souls in purgatory, but there is very little tenderness for the bodies of the dead here. For the very poor, there are immediately outside one angle of the walls and behind a jutting point of the fortification, near the sea, certain common pits, one for every day in the year, which all remain closed up until the turn of each comes for its daily reception of dead bodies. Among the troops in the town, there are usually some Swiss, more or less. When any of these die, they are buried out of a fund, maintained by such of their countrymen as are resident in Genoa. Their providing coffins for these men is a matter of great astonishment to the authorities. Certainly, the effect of this promiscuous and indecent splashing down of dead people in so many wells is bad. It surrounds death with revolting associations that insensibly become connected with those whom death is approaching. Indifference and avoidance are the natural result, and all the softening influences of the great sorrow are harshly disturbed. There is a ceremony, when an old cavaliere or the like expires, of erecting a pile of benches in the cathedral to represent his bier, covering them over with a pall of black velvet, putting his hat and sword on the top, making a little square of seats about the whole, and sending out formal invitations to his friends and acquaintances to come and sit there and hear Mass, which is performed at the principal altar, decorated with an infinity of candles for that purpose. When the better kind of people die, or are at the point of death, their nearest relations generally walk off, retiring into the country for a little change and leaving the body to be disposed of, without any superintendence from them. The procession is usually formed and the coffin borne and the funeral conducted by a body of persons called a confraternita, who as a kind of voluntary penance undertake to perform these offices in regular rotation for the dead, but who, mingling something of pride with their humility, are dressed in a loose garment covering their whole person, and wear a hood concealing the face, with breathing holes and apertures for the eyes. The effect of this costume is very ghastly, especially in the case of a certain blue confraternita belonging to Genoa, who, to say the least of them, are very ugly customers, and who look, suddenly encountered in their pious ministration in the streets, as if they were ghouls or demons bearing off the body for themselves. Although such a custom may be liable to the abuse attendant on many Italian customs, of being recognized as a means of establishing a current account with heaven, on which to draw too easily for future bad actions, or as an expiation for past misdeeds, it must be admitted to be a good one and a practical one, and one involving unquestionably good works. A voluntary service like this is surely better than the imposed penance, not at all an infrequent one, of giving so many licks to such and such a stone in the pavement of the cathedral, or than a vow to the Madonna to wear nothing but blue for a year or two. This is supposed to give great delight above, blue being, as is well known, the Madonna's favorite color. Women who have devoted themselves to this act of faith are very commonly seen walking in the streets. And with those observations, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Pictures from Italy by Charles Dickens, who has a most marvelous way of creating those pictures for us. I can practically and unfortunately smell the place. I hope you enjoyed that as well. If you'd like to read this marvelous work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.